Welcome back to Jeremy, Roman Empire, where we discuss how the Roman Empire not only forms the world we live in, but how it also predicts our future as well. As I think there's so much to learn from it. Reminder to like this video, leave us a comment, or smash that subscribe button if you want to help us grow and help us see more action. And I'm very excited for the conversation we're going to have today. As you guys know, I've been reading about the Roman Empire way back since when I was in grad school, and I wrote my dissertation on the worship of Augustus, which I found to be very interesting. But today's guest is someone I've read a lot from, and I really enjoy his writing style, Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy. So, Dr. Goldsworthy, thank you so much for hanging out with me today, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, for people that may not be familiar with you, I know your background is primarily in military history, which led you to studying a lot of the things you have around Rome. But just give us a little idea of your background for people that may not be familiar.
Well, I started out down the familiar academic route, and my doctoral thesis was about how the Roman army actually operated, rather than the army as its impact on society and its promotionalism, all of which are interesting, but you have to remember what an army is for and how it does things. Since then, I've turned from teaching, which I haven't really done for a long time now, and I've moved more to writing, trying to write about the big people and the big topics of the ancient world. And my idea is to write something that is interesting and understandable, accessible to anyone who's wants to pick the book up in the first place. So, biography of Antony and Cleopatra, they may have seen the Shakespeare play, they may have some idea, or the Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton film from years ago. Then they want to know more. And it works on the basis of, we all get interested in the ancient world because it's interesting in so many ways, and it's full of larger than life characters, but so many of the issues seem to have relevance. Trying to explain why it's so exciting to people, but without patronizing the reader. But also without assuming that they've already spent several years studying this. So my idea is to try and present the ideas that I hope are as up-to-date as they can be, as insightful as they can be, but make it interesting, because in the end, we're talking about people, human beings and societies, and it is interesting. And they are not so very different from us, in spite of all the attitudes of society of 2,000 years ago. Essentially, they're human beings living their lives as we do. So that's where I see history, both for its interest, but also for its relevance, is within that.
Well, that's what I enjoy most about your work, because I feel like a lot of history doesn't include that human element. One of my favorite history books that I've read was called So You Think You Know the Civil War, about the American Civil War. And it was all these really interesting things about Stonewall Jackson, for example. He used to chew on lemon rinds, and he felt like he had to sit exactly upright because his internal organs had to be straight so he could ride a horse properly. So there's all these interesting things you learn about human beings. And I think a lot of historians are missing that. And I think that teaches us so much about history to understand the people.
It's, again, the trend with academic history for well over a century, really, has been to move away from personality and try to focus on, the underlying trends, the economic factors, the social trends that shape this. And it tends to reduce everybody to a representative of some bigger theme that's going on. Caesar happens because of instability within the Republic. And that might be true. That creates the space for this dramatic career. But in the end, it's a human being who makes choices and does things. And he is an individual. And it happens in a peculiar way. Someone like Stonewall Jackson is eccentric in many respects, but that affects, he has that talent, he has that ability, but also it means the things he does are done in a slightly different way because that individual is doing it. And all the other people involved, we tend to see the leaders more because more is written about them, particularly in the ancient world. To get, you could go to the Civil War and you can read plenty of letters, diaries of ordinary soldiers, a private in one of the regiments, and get that perspective, which is very different to a Lee or a Jackson or a Grant. But we get both. For the Roman period, we rarely, if ever, get that sort of lower level view. But again, it's important to remind ourselves that isn't because these people were just automata that were ordered around by Pompey, by Caesar, by Crassus, whoever it might be. Those stories were there. It's just we can't reach them. Those individuals that made up these big events are all there. So it's trying to make sure that history is always about people.
Before we kind of dive into Caesar here, the one question I did want to ask you is, what was your inroad into having an interest in studying Rome? Because I know for me, I was obsessed with Alexander the Great in undergrad, and I read this one article about after the Battle of Actium, Augustus goes and praises the sarcophagus of Alexander. I'm like, that's really weird. Why did he do that? So I guess for you, what was that thing that made you have so much focus on Rome?
History in general, I find fascinating. So I can go anywhere, see something. It was probably. It might actually have been while I was doing some lectures to do with the Caesar book, which came out, back in about 2007, 2008. And while I had a few days gap between these, I went down to Colonial Williamsburg in Yorktown, and since then have read loads about the Revolution, just because there was something there that stood me. So that it's often a place that means something, but there's something. I mean, it was watching the old epic movies, the Ben-Hur, Spartacus, that sort of thing, cropped up a lot whenever there was a festival or a holiday in Britain. It would seem to crop up on the television. And then something like 20 miles to the east of where I grew up is a place called Caerleon, which was the base of Legio II Augusta for several centuries, from the late 1st century AD through to the 4th. It's got an amphitheater, it's got barrack blocks. So I could go and I could touch things the Romans left. So I think that added to, there's something very dramatic, and the Hollywood spectacle of those epics called out to me in some respect. But Roman history felt like my history. It felt like the history of people who'd lived where I lived, in a way that, say, Greek history didn't quite, or Egyptian. They were interesting, but they were a bit more distant. The Romans had come here, they'd come to where I lived, they'd come to Britain, they'd come nearby, and that was quite exciting. It just made it a little bit more immediate. So I think that's the root of it. And then, as one of my friends said, you may not like the Romans, but they're never dull. There are so many good stories, so many larger-than-life characters in it all, and so much to discover as well. I've been at it decades now, and I keep either rereading that, or I'd never thought of that way. So there's so much still to do.
So I guess when we're looking at Caesar, what shaped his early life and ambitions? His upbringing is very interesting, as he grows up in a patrician family that doesn't really have any money after the death of his father. So I'm kind of curious, how does his early life shape his later political machinations?
We've got to be a little careful, obviously, because the stories of his early life are written down later on when people know what his later life was going to be like. They know the end, in a sense. So you have that sense of someone who from the beginning is destined for distinction, infamy, perhaps, that probably exaggerates. Caesar is clearly always a very ambitious young man, but then most Roman aristocrats are. You have that situation where you have this family name, as you say, it's a patrician. You go back to the real ancient aristocracy of Rome, but your family hasn't done a lot for a very long time. There's nobody around. There's a branch of the family. There are some Julii Caesares that are cousins to some degree that are starting to do well around about the time of Caesar's father, but they're in a different voting tribe. They're probably not that close. There's a similarity of name which helps. So you've got somebody who is very ambitious. All the stories suggest that you have this immense self-confidence as well, that Caesar has a high opinion of his abilities and his capacity, and with some justification, because he does seem to have that knack of being really good at whatever he does. But again, we tend to forget this because I think there's a sort of calming influence because of the nature of Cicero and the weight of information that he gives us, and that sense of normality from his letters, that we think that the 60s and 50s are quite calm and quiet when they're not really. We forget just how violent the early part of the 1st century BC was. I mean, Caesar is born just over a year after the final defeat of the Cimbrian Teutones, when you've had this threat of this vast, as far as you're concerned, barbarian army storming into Italy, taking Rome, just like the Gauls had done in the 4th century BC. They've inflicted heavier losses than you've suffered since the days of Hannibal. Really appalling series of catastrophes, and it's Marius that stops them. So you've had those scares, then you've had violence within Rome, and of course, when Caesar's in his early teens, you have Sulla, the civil war that ends up with people's heads being nailed up in the Forum Rome, an awful lot of prominent people die violently. Now, Caesar's father's dead by this time, so he doesn't have direct involvement. Because he is married to one of the opponents of Sulla, Caesar himself becomes a fugitive for a while. He refuses to divorce his wife. So you've got that sense from the very start that I don't think you would have had from somebody born 50 years earlier in the Roman Republic, that politics is extremely dangerous. That there is always that it's going to have you murdered, it's going to turn to civil war. When you look at it, most of the big names of the first century BC die violent deaths, the vast majority. And that because we're so familiar with this period, we sometimes calm it all down and we think it's all fairly settled. We forget that. So I think fear is something that Caesar's generation grows up with. It tempers their ambition. There's a sense that the higher you get, the more dangerous things will be, but also the sense that you're not safe anyway. So you really need to succeed and keep on succeeding. So reinforcing the traditional Roman aristocrats' upbringing, which tells you your family has done this. There have been consuls in the past. There have been people who've celebrated triumphs. You are expected to live up to this family reputation. And the emphasis, again, it comes later, and most of it's Augustan, and later the sense of his mother Aurelia. Again, being in the place of somebody who's bringing you up with this sense of expectation that your family needs you to do great things, to live up to that name. So you have this obligation. You also have this natural ambition. You deserve to be at the top of things because of who you are. In Caesar's case, reinforced by that, as I say, immense sense that, well, I am really good. And when I look around at the mediocrities that are in the Senate or in high office, they seem incompetent, they seem corrupt, they just don't seem to be. There's very little to inspire people with a sense that the Republic is great and things are working perfectly in this period, because with a civil war, they are clearly not. And
well, let me ask you about that then too, because so I had this professor in grad school, Dr. Dermot Quinn, and he always used to hate the word forces of history. He used to hate it.
Yeah.
But I think when you look at kind of history as a flow, it's a balance between these forces of history and also the great men. I think thinking of the great men theory versus the forces of history theory, it's a little bit of both. And I guess when you look at Caesar in that Civil War era, would he have been able to do what he did and accomplish what he did if he did not grow up during this kind of, Roman Civil War from 133 to 31 era?
I think the answer's got to be no. He would probably have been somebody who got to the consulship, governed a province, perhaps celebrated a triumph. If Caesar had been born in the same way that if Cato had been born at the time of Hannibal's invasion, they would either have died in the fighting or they would have been heroes of the Republic. Unambiguously so, because there was a big enemy and they were the sort of talent that comes forward then. One of the problems with the way things are working in the late Republic is that people are suspicious of talent. And, it is, in the end, you come back to the situation, not to jump too far forward, but in the Civil War, there is, as Cicero saying, why do you make this man strong and then turn against him? Give him all these opportunities. And Caesar's commentaries on Gaul, they are essentially a justification of, I did all this for the good of the Republic. And you gave me this responsibility, I don't know. So they want to, I think, I'm not one of these people who believes that Caesar always wanted to be dictator, wanted to be supreme, which of course is something you're getting in the sources, quotes attributed to elder statesmen like Catullus and people like that, Caesar is plotting this from the beginning. His early career is entirely conventional, flamboyant, but conventional. And I think the distinction he wants is a very traditional distinction, is he believes he should be a leading member of the Senate. He should win high office. He proves himself to be an accomplished commander and therefore serves the state in the most glorious way possible, defeating the enemies of the Roman Republic. And you come back to later on and think, well, what would really have been so bad if they'd let Caesar come back in 49 BC and stand for a second consulship and then gone off to fight the Parthians or have another province? Isn't that how the system is supposed to work? Mm-hmm. So this is a confused time. And it's, again, there are big factors involved. It's easy to forget that Sulla doubles the size of the Senate, mm-hmm. which immediately has an impact. Yes, there's some increase in the number of magistracies around, but nevertheless, there's a lot more people seeking high office. but there's also not that much talent because he's filled it with people who did him a good turn during the Civil War, backed him, or at the very least didn't upset him.
Mhm.
And they are very keen on preserving that distinction. So you've got, lots of people obviously feel that descendants of Marius's supporters shouldn't be barred from politics permanently. These groups that appear and they will crop up with Catiline and, oh, sorry, hang on a minute.
No worries.
Sorry, for some reason a Hewlett-Packard alert just shot up in the middle of I didn't even think this was a Hewlett-Packard computer, but there we go. So, sorry, do you want me to go back or?
No, you can continue. We'll just cut this part out. Not a big deal.
Okay. So there is that element of there's another factor involved in that everything is costing more money. There's more people around competing for offices.
Mm-hmm.
There's much more money come in from empire. A lot of people have done very well out of backing the right side in the Civil War. So to succeed, you need to spend more. And it's the same. You see the escalation in the scale of celebrating triumphs, but the amount you need to lavish on the public to make your aedileship successful, as Caesar does, or when you're campaigning for any office, everything is costing more, which means that for somebody like Caesar, you're taking these risks and you're borrowing money, investing, you're basically getting people to invest in your future.
Well, that's the question I have. That's a perfect transition. That's actually the next question I had. And I guess looking at it, we look at Caesar, and something I got out of your book that I really didn't know about Caesar, because as I said, I studied more of the empire, and kind of getting into your work was looking more at the Republic, is this idea that he's this broke patrician that his entire career he's borrowing money for his next big step. So a lot of the risks he's taking is because if this doesn't go right for him, he's kind of, everything's over, right? There's a conversation, I think it's, and I don't remember the exact quote, but there's a conversation with his mother after the election for Pontifex Maximus, where basically, he's going to be ruined or he's going to have everything. And I guess when we look at kind of this career of Caesar, how do you describe kind of the money side of things for him? Because I think a lot of people don't fully understand the position he was in and the risks he was taking.
It's partly this sort of great inflation, the sheer costs of public life, and public life in Rome is very public. You've got to show off in your house, where you live, how you act, how you behave, so that people will take you seriously and then vote for you when the time comes. Because it is very much personality and reputation-based politics rather than about policies as such. So all of that's much more expensive because there's just more money around and there's more people around with it that are all trying for in the end, there's still 2 consulships. That number has not increased, and you can't share that office. So there's that big risk. And you've got people like Catiline around there, who in a sense is Caesar somewhat older. He's had more of an active role in the Sullan Civil War, a patrician from a family that's faded away from the center of politics, but feels that he ought to be at the top, and recklessly, basically takes out large loans and takes risks, and eventually it fails, and he ends up as a rebel, and he ends up dying as a rebel. With Caesar, he's, as you say, the comment to his mother of the Pontifex Maximus, I'll come back a victor or I won't come back at all. He's borrowed lots of money because there are people out there who are spending their wealth to make themselves spectacularly comfortable, but also opulent and show off in that respect. The Lucullus and people like that, Hortensius, people of this sort, the fish fanciers, as they get dubbed, from their sort of ornamental lake ponds and the grand villas and all this. There's something Sallust rants about in the Catilinarian conspiracy in particular. Caesar is doing a lot of that. When he puts on games, they're more flamboyant than anybody else's. You've got citizenship about it, which helps. The thing is with all these things, and you could say it's the same with politics today, or making, say, a Hollywood blockbuster. You can throw money at something, but it doesn't guarantee success. It gives you a chance, but you can still make a mess of it, and people can still decide they don't like it. So at every stage, you're appearing in the courts, in public, in the forum. You're spending on games. You're standing for office. You're speaking in the Senate. You're trying to be seen and very visible. You want to be noticed. You want to be notorious, even with Caesar and his womanizing. It's better to be gossiped about than to be, unknown. But it's very, very risky, because at any stage it goes wrong. If ever Caesar gets to a point where he stands for an office and doesn't get it, then those creditors that have essentially, they've almost bought stock in Caesar. the assumption is that he will pay them back either in terms of money that he's borrowed, or in terms of favors and importance and influence, because he will get to that point where he is somebody who has that power to do things you want. And Crassus is obviously his biggest backer, or becomes his biggest backer. But you have the story that before he goes off to Spain and govern that as pro-praetor, that a lot of his creditors have just decided, no, this man isn't going to succeed. I want as much of my money back now as I possibly can. And Crassus covers the debts, allows him to go. He fights a war in the province, so is able to, stabilize things, and then goes to Gaul and makes himself fabulously wealthy. But again, Caesar's wealth isn't about accumulating money for the sake of money. It's then invested in other things. He gives out loans. He does the same thing that people have done for him. He does favors for other politicians to make them his friends. He gets, even Cicero helps in buying up property to create Caesar's Forum. That bit you can't see much of it near the Senate House, near the Curia Julia today in Rome. That's you're investing to show off, this is something I'm giving to the Roman people, isn't that great? But you're also, all the contracts for material, for labor, all of this thing, you're injecting money in a sense into the economy, but it's up to you, and you're putting lots of people into your debt. So the more cash you have, if you use it wisely, you can get tremendous influence. But you need that skill in how to use it. And then you need to convince people that you are viable, that you are not about. So, there's a sense almost it is like a company operating today. People will keep buying shares in it, or they will keep them. But if there's a panic and there's a sudden run on your Caesar stocks, basically, then your career can go. I mean, that's probably one of the easier ways of thinking about it. It's not exact, but it's close to that sense of how it works in Roman politics.
It's interesting too, and I guess not to pull us too far off, but one of the big things I focused on in my writing is looking at Pompey and Caesar did it a little bit differently, right? Caesar did it more through military powers. Pompey did it short through his conquest, but he actually used the idea of Eastern religion and kind of getting people to love him more, which is something Caesar doesn't really do as much. It's more about power. But I guess when we're looking at Caesar and his relationship with the Senate, I think that's the thing that's really interesting. I guess taking a look at that consulship year he has in 59. How does this relationship with the Senate kind of set us up for everything that's else to come? Because it's a very interesting time period where you have his colleague Bibulus doesn't really get to do anything. He stays in his home. He has this competition with Cato throughout the whole year, where Cato just decides anything Caesar does, I'm going to do the opposite. So I guess, how do we describe this relationship with the Senate, and how does this kind of set up the future of where things are going to go?
One of the first things we've got to start with, and it's so hard because we all do it, because it's just natural, is we do talk of the Senate. And we tend to suggest a coherence that you've got these 600 people who act as one and basically are of one mind. And therefore, Caesar is opposed by the Senate. It's the senatorial faction that is defeated in the civil war, and Caesar becomes dictator. But the Senate is 600 or so individuals, all scrabbling for prestige, all for office. Caesar is, of course, himself a senator, as is Pompey, as is Crassus, as Cicero, Cato, all of these different groups. And there aren't the fixed parties that we expect, but also there are lots of issues where people will go a different way. And Caesar comes in with a lot of support within the Senate in 59 and later. And remember, quite a lot of people remain neutral in the Civil War. They don't want to commit to either side. Most people, it's not my problem. Why are we tearing the world apart for this? In Caesar's case, in 59, it's interesting because he's done what appears to be fairly rare in Roman politics, in that he's made it very clear what he wants to do as consul whilst he's been standing for office in the first place. Yes, there's an emphasis, I'm a great guy, so vote for me. But the land legislation, the reform, the redistribution of some public land, this theme that goes back to the Gracchi and beyond, Caesar's tried before. You've had the land reform by Rullus and others attempted. No one's really succeeded because there's lots of vested interest in stopping this happening. Caesar has come up with a law that he has framed very, very carefully. So he's come into office very prepared, ready to go. Because again, as consul, you've got a year, but 1 month you're supposed to have the priority. The next month your colleague has the priority and dictates the agenda. He also presents it. Caesar does everything to be reasonable, or at least to appear as if he's being reasonable, and says, well, look, if there's anything in this you want to change, tell me what it is, we'll change it, presents it to the Senate. The Senate rejects. This is when you have Cato, basically filibustering, because the Senate can't meet after sunset. So if a thing isn't decided, then the meeting's adjourned and you can't just resume. You've got to start again. And there's also some other things that are on the agenda. So you have that. That's when Caesar has him led out, and Cato. It's one of those marvelous moments where he really milks the crowd and ends up. Caesar's tried to get rid of him because he's just being a nuisance, but Cato ends up turning the sympathy round to him, even though he's just being awkward. And there is that sense that you have the quote that I like everything about this law apart from the man who's proposing it. And that very Roman sense, particularly in these last few generations, that I'd rather let a problem continue than for somebody I don't like to get the credit for solving it. So with Caesar, you have the reasonable, and then you go to the public meetings and say, well, the Senate's not going to let this through, so what do you, the Roman people, think? You then have Cato's attempt to get a tribune to veto what Caesar's doing. It's all very negative. Bibulus's whole thing, the fellow consul, is, I've seen bad auspices, so we can't do anything today. Basically, I'm going to solve. And then after a rioting, then he retreats to his house and just keeps on claiming that the auspices are bad. It's basically trying to prepare for the future, saying, I'm legally undermining what's going on. But as I say, the odd thing about all this is that actually, even a lot of his opponents seem to think this is a good piece of legislation, and most of what he's doing is actually fairly sensible. And the subsequent arguments and the criticism of Caesar are not really about what he did, but it's all about the way he did it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being set up in the sense that, again, there's a level of inertia at the heart of the Roman state in that you are so busy with your faction fighting and trying to stop people you don't like doing things that you're just going to let things potter along and nothing really happen. So basically, each side, it's a bit like a confrontation over the card table. They each keep raising the stakes and thinking the other one's going to back down. And a general pattern of Roman aristocrats in general, but people like Caesar, but like Cato as well, is that they're not good at backing down. Mm-hmm. They tend to think, no, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. And it's the stubbornness that has allowed the Romans to win so many wars and survive.
Well, it's the whole idea of dignitas, right? Like Caesar is very upset about anything that is an insult to his dignitas.
Yeah, and it's this sense that if you accept any insult, then there'll just be more. So it's a very, and it's not, it's in a particularly pronounced form, but this has deep roots to the sense of honor you'd see amongst the Greek aristocracy. To the point where you'll have, Cicero will be quoting Homer when he's deciding what he needs to do in some of these occasions. It's that sense of my personal honor is so important, because if I can't, make people respect me, then they're not going to, and it's going to get worse. So it is this strange thing, and that there is this very strong clash of personalities. It doesn't help that very clearly Cato loathes Caesar. And it doesn't help again that Caesar's been having the long affair with Servilia, Cato's half-sister. So you feel there's a clash of personality, but there's also an element. Caesar has based a reputation, become famous by being this man who has these principles, and this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to stick with it. Cato is playing exactly the same game, and very often from the debate over what you should do with the Catilinarian conspirators in 63, do you execute them, do you imprison them? Caesar takes one side, Cato takes the other. Both sort of benefit. There's almost this rivalry that makes them both more famous, because that conflict between them is something people want to hear about and they find interesting. But it doesn't make for very good decision-making when it comes to the government of the state and the republic.
So I guess looking at post-consulship then, and looking at kind of the Civil War era, which we could have a whole nother or the Gallic War era, which we could have a whole nother conversation on, and you've also written extensively on as well. But I guess looking at this era in time, to me, it says two things about Caesar. Number one, his military decision making, right? It's if you look at, he makes the wrong decisions, but he makes the right decisions more often than he makes the wrong ones. He often puts himself at the front to encourage his men. But I think at the same time, he was, and this is the thing I talk about more and more often, he was brilliant from a public relations perspective. Because if you look at how he talked about it and how he wrote about it, it showed the Roman people what he was doing for Rome and kind of created this lore of himself. So I guess when you look at the Gallic War era, how does this enhance how Caesar is seen, and how does this set him up for where things are headed in the future?
It's very interesting because, as you say, he's always got more than one eye on what's happening in Rome, what's happening in Italy, and how people are thinking and reacting to what he's doing. And again, remember, he's commanded in Spain and been awarded a triumph there for his governorship. But before that point, he hasn't had a vast amount of military experience. He's got been decorated for gallantry, got the Corona Civica, the civic crown, as a young junior officer. But other than that, he's not done a lot. He's not a military man like Pompey, who is very much the early part of his career is all about commanding troops. And it's only later he goes into politics. Caesar sort of flips it, does it the other way round, in that from about the age of 39 onwards, he spends most of his life on campaign. But up until then, he hasn't spent a huge amount of time with the army. But he has that power of words. And if the commentaries are often used to teach youngsters Latin because it's very pure Latin, which
I did this in grammar school, so I'm laughing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, most of us do.
I went to Catholic school, so we did Caesar's commentaries in 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. So anyway.
And when you're struggling with Latin, it can be really hard work. Mm-hmm. Later, if you come from reading a Sallust or a Cicero or Livy, who have their merits, but there is a plainness, a deceptive simplicity about Caesar's narrative that it makes it very easy. It's one of the reasons it's set for children, is that it's easier to cope with. But we forget the power of those words, and this is always the story. It's nostri, our men are doing this, our boys. But Caesar, I think, stands with somebody like Churchill, with his ability with language. This is a leader who can communicate incredibly powerfully and memorably, so that's very, very rare. And of course, historically, Caesar's campaigns are largely judged through his own account of them. And a lot of people would like to have their deeds judged on that basis. But he has it's not simply because he was famous, it's because these are remarkable works of literature in themselves. But they are very much based around what's going on. And I think I like the idea that they were designed very much to be read aloud. And if you look at the commentaries and the details, senators appear in it, noblemen appear in it, Labienus, his senior subordinate, appears a lot, but you get, Cicero's brother Quintus is there, other people do. Sometimes they criticize, but a lot of them do fairly well. Caesar, obviously, third person, is there all the time. The general but there's very little detail of what he's doing. You have the famous account at the River Sabis where he grabs a shield from a man in the rear ranks because he hasn't brought his own with him, pushes his way to the front, and then restores the situation. But even that is very modestly written. It allows you to imagine. People often say, this shows Julius Caesar pushing into the front ranks and fighting. Well, he never mentions fighting. He talks about giving orders and encouragement and redeploying the unit. But your imagination fills this in with him taking out these sort of wild-haired Gauls coming out of the mist. But whereas Pompey had other people write accounts of his campaigns which stress leading cavalry charges, killing enemy leaders with his own sword, with his own spear, very Alexandrian in his style, Caesar just let you imagine that. But the other great hero, you have nostri, our men, the ordinary soldiers, but the people who really stand out are the centurions. And these are often named, and they're singled out as, even when Caesar doesn't name them specifically, he talks about addressing them by name. Because we have this old sort of rather mistaken view that, they're basically, sergeant majors, this sort of character, most of these centurions are probably coming from the local aristocracy of the towns of Italy, the cities of Italy. And that's the people I think this book is aimed at. The commentary is very much so. And it's one of the reasons why Caesar is so popular with this class, because he presents them in a very favorable light. They're the officers. They're the people who never fail him. And if they fail him once or twice, it's only because they're too brave sometimes, as a Gergovia or this sort of thing. But otherwise they never quit. They keep on fighting. They'll fight to the last. They inspire, they go on. the aristocrats, the tribunes, the people like that, they get their fair share of criticism. So we sometimes, because our sources tend to talk very much about the Senate, and every now and again we get the equestrian orders on the fringes of the Senate, we forget there are more people of political importance who are Roman citizens and who are Italians. And particularly when it comes to voting for the consulship and this sort of thing, these are people whose vote really, really matters.
Mhm.
And that's the very group that are, in a sense, the sort of the heroes of these criminals. So he doesn't just celebrate himself, he celebrates a very significant part of Roman society that we tend to ignore because we tend to think of the Roman world as having the rich, the aristocrats, and the poor. And we forget that that covers a huge range of different statuses, different economic levels, and their own perception, how they view each other. So there's a lot of interesting politics within that I think is not always as exploited as it should be.
Well, I think as well, if you look at that, one of the big things that Sulla did is he tried to make the tribune a dead end position, right? Because it was something that played to the idea of the popular idea. And you see that Caesar is someone that really gets, whether he believes what he's doing or doesn't believe what he's doing, he really understands how important popular power is to make his next step.
Yes, I mean, we're still, even though it's decades and decades since people spoke in simple terms of optimates and populares and all that sort of thing, but there is that approach where you champion popular causes, but Caesar has that knack of winning people over. And there is that element, again, that comes back to the human dimension of all of this. Julius Caesar had charisma by the bagful. Yes, he's very skilled with words, but there was obviously something about this man that could persuade people to do things. And, he gets that remarkable loyalty from his soldiers, most of whom, when he starts in Gaul, they're strangers to him. And yet he wins them over to the point where, even if he exaggerates a little bit, the defections are all one-sided during the Civil War, and his army is simply better. He wins the Civil War. It's the comment of, Caelius, Cicero's correspondent. I think Pompey's got the better cause, but Caesar's got the better army, so I'm joining Caesar. There is a great truth to that. When they, most of the situations where the main army from Gaul meets opposition, it always wins. And it always beats the opposition. And it's a deal that's not happened overnight. It's a gradual thing with that trust that's there, but it's because he takes the trouble and he has that ability to address a crowd, to address a parade in the soldiers. And again, with individuals, even the sort of the seducer element of Caesar, he is clearly incredibly charming and has a force of personality that is rare and very unusual. The sense that the Pompey's allies in the early stages of the Civil War won't let him meet Caesar in person because they don't quite trust him not to be charmed by this and won over. I mean, there's other factors as well because they've got all sorts of reasons not to trust him, and he's got very strong reasons not to trust them. But there's this element that you do feel this Civil War is pointless. If they'd sat down and talked it through, they probably could have sorted this out.
Well, I guess when we look at kind of that Civil War, speaking of the Civil War that Caesar lived through, rather than, I guess, kind of Ronald Syme's Civil War from kind of earlier in the century. But I guess looking at the one that Caesar himself lived through, how do you react to that situation? Because it seems like, and once again, this is my opinion, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems like Caesar didn't want to take it to the point of crossing the Rubicon and going to where things went. But it seems like there was a continual push by the people in power that they actually made him into what he became. And I guess looking at it, how do you react to this Rubicon crossing in the direction that the Civil War went?
Again, we tend to talk of the Senate opposing Caesar, but if you think of that famous division within the Senate that's vetoed by a tribune, so it can't go on the books, where only 22 of them vote for just Caesar to disarm, and there's an overwhelming majority for both Pompey and Caesar to disarm, and let's just not have a civil war. Most people don't want this. Most senators want peace, want stability, because you want to, civil war is risky, whatever you do. But there is that. It again perhaps comes back to one of the legal problems, is because Caesar can't leave his province without laying down his imperium, all the negotiations go on from at a distance. and you can't meet face to face. Even to the extent where Pompey has to stay outside Rome because he can't lose his imperium. So the Senate is meeting outside the Pomerium, the formal boundary of the city, to include him. But there are rumors. Late in 50, a rumor circulates that Caesar has invaded Italy, and one of the consuls takes a sword to Pompey and asks him to defend the state, and then they discover it hasn't actually happened. So you've got these dramatic moments. That consul in question then doesn't fight against Caesar in the civil war when it does happen a few weeks later. I think it comes back to this brinkmanship. There is that sense that each side thinks the other will back down. And you have that despairing sense of Cicero, who again has imperium, so is waiting outside the city. He's just come back from Alesia while this is going on. Comes back to this, why fight Caesar now when you've made him so strong? Because Caesar could argue that he's done exactly what the Republic asked him to do. They gave him this position, they gave him these powers, they extended his imperium of this enlarged province. He's delivered. There have been more days of public thanksgiving voted by the Senate for Caesar than any other Roman general in the past, including Pompey. You've had this spectacular number. And again, it's a sense of this inflation. And that's only just happened. That's only a year or so ago. Mm-hmm. So why suddenly is he a war criminal, or is this man who's going to destroy the state? He is, again, you can argue over the details, but he's waited the 10 years that seems to be specified by law to stand for the consulship for a second time. It's amazing how I'm pretty sure each side thinks the other one will back down if they just push, and neither wants to give in. And you have the comment, with Pompey again saying, well, what if Caesar wants to keep his army and stand for the consulship? What if my son should attack me with a stick? Dismiss it. No, that's not going to happen. Pompey is probably the main person who makes the civil war happen, because he is asserting himself as separate from Caesar, and that Caesar needs to court him, whilst trying to assure Caesar, yes, I'm your friend, I'll protect you. Because Caesar has to trust Pompey to look after him, and Pompey doesn't have a great record on this sort of thing. But he's also, through that, to accept that Pompey has the ability to protect him, and therefore that Pompey is his superior in auctoritas, in dignitas, in all of these very important concepts, even though they're not a formal power. So there's an element where, with Lucan will write later on that the civil war happens because Pompey will not accept an equal and Caesar will not accept a superior. So there is, again, it comes back to this personal thing, because in the end, there's no real ideological cause of this civil war. It is simply about, are we going to let Julius Caesar go on, and he's already had a distinguished career? Will he continue this and have an even more distinguished career? And Caesar wants that. Some rivals within the Senate don't want him to have that. And that's essentially what it's about. The comments Suetonius reports of Caesar looking at the dead Pompeians after the Battle of Pharsalus, that they wanted this. But for my army, they would have passed judgment on me. It comes down to it. It is as simple as that. But an awful lot of other Romans are willing to take their side. And I think it is a mistake to view them as entirely naive. But you can see the point of view of Caesar's army, whose glory was obviously tied up with that of the commander who'd led them, that they've done all this, they've suffered all of this, they've won all these victories, and suddenly you're saying that we shouldn't have done this. After 10 years, it's probably a reflection. I mean, that on the other hand, people will also fight against Caesar. In the main, with the aristocrats, there seems to be more ideology involved. But again, remember, the majority of the Senate remains neutral, doesn't want to get involved. But they're also very frightened, because the last real civil war that anyone can remember is Sulla, and Marius before that, and the sort of escalation of massacre that led to the proscriptions. So hence you get Caesar and his clementia, this clemency that he's promising, that I will treat anyone who wants to be neutral can be. I will not treat them as an enemy, whereas the other side do declare them, if you're not with us, you're against us. That's rather shocking. And you have Curio. Cicero mentions that is saying even he wasn't convinced that Caesar was genuine. He thought Caesar would turn nasty eventually. But it's the way Roman aristocrats think, because that's what's happened before. Mm-hmm. And probably a lot of them are thinking, well, if I was in that position, I'd do it, because I don't want to leave people around. And of course, the paradox of it all is that Caesar will be murdered by a conspiracy that involves a lot of people that he spared in the first place. Hence the fact that the Mark Antony Lepidus and Octavian will emphasize this point and say, well, we're prescribing you because when somebody was nice to you, you just turned on him. So, you've earned this. You've shown this is the only way to deal with you.
Well, I have two final questions for Adrian, because I know I want to respect your time as well, and I think it's much later in the day than for you than it is for me. But I guess looking at it, I'm not really going to jump too much into the assassination of Caesar, because there could be a whole nother conversation about that. But I guess looking at his dictatorship and the reforms that he created, how important are those reforms to, I guess, kind of the empire that will become and also the modern world that we live in?
In some ways, it's very deep. The most obvious one being the calendar and that reform to create the solar year, the months we have to this day. We're talking. After all, we're doing this interview in July, after Julius Caesar. So there's one thing I think people forget is that Caesar isn't in Rome very much in those years. The civil war is ongoing. He spends a long time in Egypt. He then has to go to Pontus. Then he comes back, is in Italy for a while before he goes off to fight the African campaign, comes back to Italy for a while. Then there's the Spanish campaign. So people often assume, Caesar has this big project. One of the big problems we have is that the way the Romans name things, whether it's a law will be a lex Julia, whether it's passed by Julius Caesar or whether it's passed by Augustus, who is also Julius Caesar. A colonia will be a colonia Julia, whoever establishes it. Trying to work out what Caesar actually did, what he said he was going to do, but didn't necessarily get time to put in place, and then what everybody in the aftermath of his murder and the civil war that follows said that this is what he either said or was doing, and that either wasn't it terrible he was killed before he could do this, or doesn't it show how we had to kill him? So it's a very hard thing to reconstruct, but there are some very consistent things. So the land reform that you've had earlier as consul and before, he carries on more of that. The emphasis on the rights of provincials, that again he's championed several times, again comes back. The restriction, he confirms the Julian law on the conduct of governors in provinces, which remodels the Sullan one. And in each case, you have the irony of somebody who's fought their way to being a dictator saying, well, do as I say, not as I do. Basically, the governor shouldn't do this sort of thing. But many aspects of that law will remain in force for centuries. It's still being cited. So generally speaking, the pattern that seems to be during the dictatorship is the same as the one for his consulship and earlier. Caesar's legislation is actually very well framed, very practical, and broadly speaking, something that most Romans accept. There are other things that obviously upset a lot of people in the further increase in the number of magistrates for the junior posts and even for the consulship. Yes, you only have 2 at a time, but you start to replace them with suffect consuls. So it's seen as less dignified. You're rewarding people that are considered to be dubious. You're packing more of your supporters, just as Sulla did. The Senate increases to 900, not far short of 1,000 strong under Caesar, as lots of people get made senator. That will then be reduced by Augustus. So there'll be some things Augustus reacts against. I'm not a believer in the old view that saw very much, Caesar does all these things, upsets people, gets murdered. Augustus comes along, looks at that example, and then does things differently. Because again, there isn't a lot of time. Caesar gets a remarkable amount done in a short time, probably through sort of forcing it through. And you have that interesting case where Cicero talks about being sent letters of thanks by provincial communities for voting in their favor in a senatorial debate, and says, well, I wasn't there and there wasn't a debate. Caesar has just done this. And again, he doesn't object to what's been done, which seems sensible. It's just the formalities have not been followed through. Again, something else people tend to forget because we take civil wars rather for granted, but every time these disturbances happen, normal government is badly disrupted. And that's particularly true for a lot of the provincial communities where to get anything done, you had to go to the governor and get him to do it, or go to Rome and get some senator to raise your case and do this. And it's why people like Augustus will spend so much of their reign traveling around the empire. If he's not doing it, Agrippa's doing it, or Tiberius is doing it, or somebody else, listening to petitions, sorting out ongoing disputes. Yes, we need to do this. This is how you're going to regulate this. All of these sorts of things. There's just this backlog. And a lot of what Caesar is doing in that time is probably answering that sort of petition and dealing with that sort of case. So a lot gets done. It may not be grand sweeping policy, but it's trying to make the state function again, trying to make the courts function again. And all of that, they starts happening under Caesar, only to be disrupted again with the subsequent civil war after his death.
So how would you, it's funny, and if you look at popular culture, I think very often popular culture likes to say that Julius Caesar killed the Republic, which I'm not a big believer in, because I think there's so many more things at play if you truly understand what was happening at the time. But who would you say killed the Republic, though, if you had to basically say an individual or a group?
Well, it's difficult because lots of people do this. When you write about this period, you often want to sort of grab them by the collar and shake them and just say, look, just talk to each other, sort this out. This really isn't, you don't need to die over this. In the end, I think the Sullan elite, the group that dominates the Senate really until its end, and they're mostly Sulla's men, though it's supplemented later on, they botch things because they tend to think very much of their own interests rather than what's good for the Commonwealth. The res publica, the public thing, the Commonwealth, this idea. And they they neglect soldiers who fought for the Republic. They don't treat them very well, so that somebody like Caesar can come along and double their pay without bankrupting the state or anything like that. It's sunk so low. You should provide for the people who fight your wars for you. And if you don't as well, the example has shown that, they're dangerous because they will support leaders who are promising them. You need to deal with the urban poor. You need to deal with some of these things, but you also need courts that function. And the levels of corruption you see in so many governors in this period, from this elite, the state doesn't work very well, or it works very much for the interests of that narrow group. And the liberty that Brutus and Cassius proclaim is very much for that small group at the very top, not just of Roman society, but at the top of the Senate, those families that dominate things, to have distinction, to win fame, and to make a fortune and squeeze the provincials for every penny they can get when they go out there. In a funny sort of way, you could argue that killing Caesar kills the Republic, because we don't know what he was going to do. Did he think that somebody like himself, he clearly was not planning on resigning, and you have that, the famous quote, Sulla didn't know his alphabet, didn't know his letters because he resigned. But we don't know. Caesar's 56, he's not marking out an heir. The man who'll become Augustus is clearly not in Caesar's lifetime anything other than a personal favorite, an heir to your private fortune. We don't know that he's fundamentally changing the position. Does he think that essentially he'll set the state going for a few years and then we'll go back to it? I think there are, again, to come back to, there are underlying problems. Things have changed, and the Senate, as it's emerged in the first century, has not been controlling things very well. But Caesar, in one sense, reminds people that one strong man who's very determined can stand up against. It's one of those things. It's part of the brinkmanship of the Civil War that he becomes the rebel. But you could argue that this is just, he's claiming that the state has been taken over by a faction, and therefore he needs to oppose them. There's so much with all of these things, we never know what would have happened if they hadn't died. What would have happened if the young Augustus had died in his 20s or his 30s, which nearly happened on several occasions? The reason you have Caesar as a name of power, you have the Principate as it develops, is very much because of Augustus. Augustus couldn't have had his career without Caesar, but when Caesar had his career, that Augustus would do what he did isn't inevitable by any means. So I think with a lot of these things, you could also come back to the Augustan claim in the Res Gestae that, he restored the Republic. Because if we mean Republic as very much this particular constitutional idea of elected magistrates and no one supreme man, But for the Romans, it's the state. And as long as you can pretend that the emperor, the princeps, is simply the highest magistrate, then it's just a variation on it. So I don't think things had to happen like that. I don't think the civil war in 49 was necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And if Pompey hadn't been so hard to read, it comes back to the Cicero comment that you just don't know what's going on behind that sort of placid face of his. You don't know what he's thinking. Nobody seemed to know that. If he hadn't empowered Cato and others and the bitterest of Caesar's opponents, there wouldn't have been a civil war. What might have happened? Would Pompey or would Caesar have gone out to fight the Parthians? Would that have succeeded? You would have had several, two strong men and maybe others emerging for a period. And then, but does that just mean you're delaying the sort of civil war that's happened for later? In the end, it comes back to the point made at the start. Individuals made decisions. Caesar was willing to fight a civil war to protect his honor, his reputation, his dignitas. Others were willing to fight a civil war to deprive him of those. And once these things start, because you've got this context where everyone has grown up knowing that civil war, that revolution, that political murder is possible because it's happened often enough. This is a Rome where the Senate House is still in ruins that Caesar started to rebuild because it's been burnt down after the rioting following Clodius's killing. Things are not normal. Things have been very disturbed for a long time. Romans have turned to violence very quickly in a way that earlier generations did not. So things have changed. People are reacting differently. But of course, once you cross any of these lines, you can't pretend it hasn't happened.
Yes.
So by contrast, the stability Augustus introduces, where you have, civil war with the death of Nero, next one after the assassination of Commodus, you have a century or so, and then another century or so without a major civil war. That doesn't sound that great till you look at what's preceded in the first century BC and what's going to follow in the third century AD and beyond. So I don't know. I don't think there's a simple answer. I don't think anyone killed the Republic. But lots of people bear blame and responsibility for putting their own status and their own rivalries above. Because again, it comes back to whether you like him or not, Caesar actually did things rather well and did things for the common good. And that's the whole purpose of the commentaries. So what would have been so bad for a second consulship? Surely what does actually happen is more disturbing for the likes of Cato, or ought to be.
Well, one final question before we let you go, Adrian, and I guess you've looked at the breadth of Caesar's life, Augustus's life, a lot of different lives as far as the empire goes. So you have a kind of a good view on the life of Caesar. What would you say that history or popular culture gets most wrong about Julius Caesar?
Well, I suppose the obvious one we started with is Caesar the emperor. But I think it's the Cleopatra factor, is that Caesar becomes the old man and Mark Antony is the young man as the lovers. And we remember that. And of course, in Shakespeare's play, we get Julius Caesar's murdered in Act 3, but he's slightly doddering, he's deaf in one ear, he can't be too big and too dominating a figure. He can't quite be the Colossus Cassius describes him as, because you're going to kill him off so soon. And really, the play is about Brutus. Brutus is the tragic hero of it, the man compelled to do something he doesn't want to do because he believes it to be right and then has to live through the consequences of that. I think it's that. I think it's hard to know just how people think of Caesar these days because, again, we don't see too much of him. He's recognizable in a sense, but it tends to be more the Shakespeare thing, or the idea of the Roman Empire is this sort of graying, balding chap in a cuirass and tunic and this sort of thing. So I don't know. I think it's Caesar the emperor is a problem. Caesar as the lover of Cleopatra is a problem because he is the important figure and she, whilst very interesting, is not. Ptolemaic Egypt doesn't have the power that it had centuries before. And there is no coincidence. We only hear about Cleopatra when she's having an affair with an important Roman. It's not simply a Roman bias in the sources. It's because that's when she entered onto the world stage. The rest of the time, She's just an allied ruler, and there are lots of them. So I think probably that side, that's because that's what we tend to remember. Caesar and Cleopatra go together very quickly. And we see them, but she's a footnote in his, an important one, no doubt, and you suspect someone who mattered a lot to him, but nevertheless one of many lovers and many affairs. So I think there's that. There's also probably Caesar the soldier. Caesar clearly was one of the greatest commanders in history and had that fluency in communication that allowed him not just to be very effective in the field, but then to tell the story so well that everybody knows he's really effective, and to tell it in a way that's particularly flattering. But again, as I said earlier, it's only really the last third of his life, which he spends almost entirely on campaign. Up until that, he's not a particularly military figure. He's much more active in the courts. He's much more active in politics. So there's lots more to Julius Caesar. And of course, the other thing is that everybody remembers the Ides of March and Caesar being stabbed. It's a little bit like Custer. He's remembered for Little Bighorn, but there was a lot more to his career than dying, on that day with half his regiment. So there is that nature. The way we tell stories, the way we remember things, particular episodes tend to sum up a person or an event and distort the picture, because yes, they're there, and yes, they were significant, but there's a lot more to the story than that.
It's funny. I did a video not long ago about Zenobia of Palmyra in the 3rd century, and I got in an argument with somebody in the comments about, basically they were trying to say Cleopatra was more important to history than Zenobia. In some ways, I think the power she held historically to be able to hold off the Roman Empire for several years like she did is, in my opinion, way more impressive than anything Cleopatra did. But anyway.
But you could also argue they're both questionably, perhaps as things go on with Zenobia, but they both start off as loyal allies of Rome. And in a sense, is Zenobia ultimately creating an empire with her son as emperor that will eventually be the Roman Empire? So yes, it has a Palmyran tint to it, but and Cleopatra in particular, she never fought against the Romans. She just keeps on ending up on the wrong side in civil wars. But that's the problem, because of the glamour. So often when I've worked on documentaries and this sort of thing, people want to make Cleopatra bigger. They want to make her more important. Actually, some of the earlier Ptolemaic queens were probably more important as actors on the stage politically and on the world stage than she was, because she's inherited a kingdom that's effectively controlled by Rome. So as you say, in that sense, Zenobia to lead and certainly be there in person with armies that are controlling a big chunk of the Eastern Empire, that's a heck of a thing. And yes, she's doing it in her son's name, but even so, it's, but there again, so much depends on sources. There are lots of people out there who would be far more prominent if we had better sources for them. Those figures in the 1st century BC, this is a critical period of Roman history, but it doesn't half help that you've got Cicero, that you've got Caesar, you've even got Catullus, and then you move into the Suetonius and the Plutarchs and people like that who are drawing on these earlier sources. It's very hard to write any sort of serious history about a Trajan, say, or a Hadrian, even a Marcus Aurelius, let alone getting into the 3rd century. So there are just those problems where the sources get so thin and so questionable. Because of Cicero, Plutarch, and the like, we know some of the jokes that were circulating and told by people like Caesar and Cicero, and that humanizes people very, very quickly.
Well, I really appreciate you spending time with us today, Dr. Goldsworthy. For people watching, I guess, what are you working on right now, and how can people watching support you?
Well, I've got my own YouTube channel, so there's videos I do one a week on that, where I ramble on in a very disorganized way about Roman ancient history mostly. I've got a book coming out next year called Athens and Sparta. Might be called A Tale of Two Cities. It might be called some other subtitle. That'll depend on the publishers, where I'm trying to look at the long 5th century BC. So I'm going earlier. I wrote a book about Philip and Alexander a few years ago, when I tried to emphasize that Alexander couldn't happen without Philip. But when I was writing that,
I would agree with that, by the way, because it was Philip. It was Philip that changed the phalanx after looking at how the Thebans fought, and then also added the Sarissa. But anyway,
but when I was writing that book, I really wanted something that was accessible and up to date, that told people what the world was like in the early 4th century BC. How did we basically get to the world where Philip has his career and then Alexander? And there wasn't one. So I decided that when I had a moment, I'd write it. And this is basically to explain, partly through the story of how come Athens and Sparta have their great moments standing side by side to fight the Persians. And then within a generation or so, they're tearing lumps out of each other, and it leads to the Peloponnesian War, this incredibly bitter. And they're both, during the Peloponnesian War, desperate to take Persian money to fight other Greeks and to fight each other. So how does that happen? You know, everybody's heard of the Thermopylae and this sort of thing, Salamis maybe. So within that, I wanted to try and present to the sort of the wider audience that sense of the Greek city-states, how these systems develop, the individuals, you know, the Pericles, Alcibiades, Themistocles, people like this. Some of these stories, because while I'm a Romanist at heart, and I'll always come back to the Romans, as I will with future books, Greek history is important, and the Romans were so often moved by and inspired by their knowledge of this Greek past that I think it deserves more attention. It's also, of course, looking at how these cities experiment with democracy, with these ideas that are still so fundamental to us, and how that plays out. So that's coming out next year sometime, because that's written. So that's the latest thing, and then I'll probably be doing something on ancient warfare next.
Cool.
Trying to argue that battles are important, but there's a lot more to wars than that. And we need to look at sieges, but we also need to look at the raiding, the lower level stuff that actually is far more common, because battles, even in the Punic Wars and things, they're very rare.
Yeah.
And they don't always, winning them doesn't always mean you win the war. So trying to look at that and how warfare can be different, and going back to the origins of warfare and through the Greco-Roman period. So that's the next one, but that's in the very early stages.
Well, we'll definitely have to chat about that when that comes out, because if you see the rest of my office, I have my Alexander the Great bust behind me. Just about every Peter Green book you could imagine on my bookshelf. Yeah. So we'll have to have a conversation. But for those of you out there watching, reminder to like this video, and please support Dr. Goldsworthy, as we appreciate his time being on the show today. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.